Hello, Politics and Media 101 listeners. John Gunnison and myself are back at it again. We hope everybody in the United States had a wonderful, relaxing Labor Day weekend. Today, we are discussing something of a more somber note, a serious topic, but has been really brought to the forefront with two somewhat recent health episodes by Minority Leader of the U.S. Senate, Mitch McConnell. As you all probably know, in July and then also on August 30th, McConnell was speaking at different events. The latest one was back in Kentucky, and he just froze up for 15, 20, 30 seconds. He just stopped speaking, froze up, could not seemingly respond. And this is after he suffered a pretty bad concussion earlier in the year, and questions about his health have been swirling. So we're going to not only get into that, but we're going to discuss Senators Dianne Feinstein, John Fetterman, Chuck Grassley, and even former Senator Thad Cochran. So, Mr. Gunnison, I think that this is a very important topic, not only because the leader of the Republican Party in the United States Senate very clearly to outsiders and many insiders who are talking about this is not up to do his job. But also, there are other senators that aren't up to do their jobs. And I think that pundits and journalists, for the most part, until recently, have done a quite horrific job of shedding light on this topic. And if there's no sunshine for something like this, then there's going to be no accountability. No accountability means there's going to be no change. And I think that this is something that deserves our attention.
Yeah, Justin, the videos that we've seen of Senator McConnell, both this week and then also in July, are striking. And they're striking in part because McConnell was such a major figure in American life for such a long time. And he was an intimidating figure. He was an imposing figure, a striking figure, someone who filled up the room. And seeing him in this condition is almost uncanny because it doesn't even feel like the same person. Someone who looms so large being really quite diminished is unsettling and sad. And I know that Senator McConnell has made many enemies across his political career, and many of the criticisms of his decisions as the Senate Majority Leader in particular, I think I personally share. But at the same time, it's sad to see a figure who was so significant in this condition. And of course, at the same time as there's much to criticize about Senator McConnell's career, there's other things to admire. There's a question of what direction the Republican conference in the Senate will go without him as its leader, and we can get into that a little bit later. But I think part of what's frustrating about this situation is, although we've seen this imagery, and it is so striking, as we've said, it doesn't seem as though we have full information about what exactly is going on. The information that we've been receiving from Senator McConnell's staff and also from I think it's the physician on top of Congress.
The attending Capitol physician, yep.
Yeah, Brian Monahan. It seems quite incomplete. And the explanations for these incidents don't seem satisfactory. They attributed to lightheadedness that he might be experiencing as a result of dehydration, or perhaps a consequence of the concussion that happened much earlier. And there's speculation that it could be something else, but we don't really have any way to draw conclusions just based on these short video clips that we've seen. So we're kind of in the dark about what's really happening.
The largest piece of speculation that is out there is that he's suffering a series of mini strokes, basically live, on TV during these events based on, armchair physicians. So physicians that are just watching from afar and not, privy to his medical records or checking it out. And it's not only age. John Fetterman's a young guy, right? And we'll get into that a little bit. So we're not being ageist here, but there are sensitivities when you start to discuss somebody's mortality, their health, their mental capacity. However, I think it's really important that we center this conversation around the fact that these are public servants. These are people who have decided to run for elected office. So they have opened themselves up to some scrutiny, their personal lives as well as their public lives. But because the job that they're doing is so public facing, Whether or not they can do that job is not only fair game, but I think we have simply a responsibility to discuss these topics, because while we might not like to, it's important for people to hear what's going on and understand maybe how broken our system is and how cavalier some of the leaders treat these issues.
Yeah, Justin, just about the speculation of what might be afflicting Senator McConnell. You mentioned stroke. Something that I've been seeing in speculation based on the apparent symptoms was that he might be suffering from aphasia, which is the condition that unfortunately ended the acting career of Bruce Willis recently. There's quite a bit of news about that. And also General Michael Hayden was another prominent figure who had to retire as a consequence. And the thing is, it is inappropriate to look at these short video clips and try to diagnose what might be going on. But the reason that people are turning to this is because of that lack of information that we're getting. And you would want to trust what you hear from a congressional physician. But as we found in the past, we really can't always trust what we're hearing from these public doctors. The incentives that they have seem to be to protect the principal. We've seen that with White House doctors in the past. For example, when President Kennedy, they were concealing that he had very serious medical afflictions at the time that he was leading the country through the Cuban Missile Crisis, a nuclear crisis that could have resulted in the bombing of New York City or Washington, D.C., killing, my entire family in New York, for example. It's a very serious matter. If the president who's steering the ship at a time like that is under the influence of all kinds of drugs, it's something that the public should know. But the doctors at the White House hid that from the public. Another recent White House doctor we had was Ronnie Jackson, who seemed like he was not being entirely forthcoming about Donald Trump's medical situation. And since he left the White House and ended his medical career, he's revealed that he is a person that probably shouldn't be trusted with those responsibilities all along. I think that the incentive that the physician in these positions has is kind of similar to the incentives that the staff members have, which is to protect and conceal the conditions around the principal. And that's a big part of the problem that we're going to be getting into, this problem of democracy, where the public have a right to know what's going on with their elected officials. And the staff are working, perhaps, to keep that information from becoming apparent, and instead really taking on the responsibilities of the elected official when they themselves, these staff members, were not elected.
Yeah, and that's why media plays such a crucial role in all of this, John, because the staff's job is to keep everything that you don't want in the public out of the public. It is to keep, the saying is passing legislation, getting an inside look at that is seeing how a sausage is made. It's very dirty. It's disgusting, but at the end product it smells good, is yummy, and just goes down so easy. People want to eat that end product, right? They want the legislation to pass, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but they don't want to necessarily know the ins and outs of how we got there. One of the justifications that the media gives itself in calling itself the fourth estate is that they are here to hold power to account. They are here to shed light on darkness, bring in transparency. Recently, what we have had happen is this extremely unhealthy relationship where the loudest voices in politics tend to be the celebrity political pundits or the political pundits or columnists at outlets that have the largest following. And whether we like it or not, the vast majority, overwhelming majority of these folks are partisan in nature. And you can very clearly tell that in their writing. I'm not talking everybody, but the gravity falls towards tribalism. And what we have happened with Senator Thad Cochran a decade ago or nearly a decade ago, we have seen with Senator Fetterman more recently, and Senator Feinstein, is that when these issues become apparent, you have these reports that'll start coming out in the media drawing questions about whether or not they're able to serve. Let's go to John Fetterman back during the campaign. A young NBC News reporter tweeted out, I think it was before the debate, that she had an interview with John Fetterman and he couldn't basically do small talk. He could not have a normal conversation. And what did we have? We had Kara Swisher, for example, New York Times, one of the most famous podcasters around, basically gaslight, essentially implying that this reporter was lying, that Fetterman just had a long podcast with her, he was completely fine, and she was leaving out a lot of important facts. And as a result, when you have these powerful pundits with millions of followers, large financial backings that have the biggest microphone attacking a young, relatively new journalist at an outlet, it causes a chilling effect. Not only does it cause the journalists to think twice because they might be attacked by other prominent pundits that are, liberal or conservative tribe members, they might get harassed by these pundits' followers. And there could be even worse because these people are so powerful in the media sphere, there could be retribution for their career. And as a result of this just rank tribalism and propaganda being spewed by some pundits, you have journalists unwilling to cover these topics. And I think that is such an important point to focus on.
You have to be careful. This is not something that's funny or is a pleasure to write about. This is a serious issue. It's really painful. Dianne Feinstein is a hero on many issues, particularly to women. She was a real trailblazer in the Senate. This is a really sad way for her to be ending her career. So you have to be sensitive about these things. But at the same time, it's really something that the voters should have known about in 2018 when she was running for re-election. And that's what a number of people around her were telling me, including people who love her and have worked for her for years.
I noticed in the case of Dianne Feinstein, there was a kind of reluctance to address this topic for various reasons, various pressures. There is such a level of esteem around Senator Feinstein and the career that she's had as a pioneering female senator who had chairmanships, who represented the largest state in the country for decades. And because of that, there was, like I said, a reluctance to talk about such a sensitive topic. I think that many elderly figures in American life have pushed back pretty strongly against attacks based on their age. Certainly President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, and Dianne Feinstein saying that it's a form of prejudice to attack a political leader because of their age. And in the cases of Feinstein and Pelosi, they also, or their representatives, their staff, would point out that they were powerful women who were in these positions, and the same sorts of attacks were not as often circulated against McConnell or other male leaders of a similar age. And they suggested that there was a gendered component to the complaint. And there was kind of a pall over the coverage of the issue in the case of Senator Feinstein. And in the 2018 election, Feinstein was challenged by a much younger Democrat, Kevin DeLeon, in California. And he tried to raise this age and health issue as a matter in that election. And he was not successful at dethroning Senator Feinstein. It was a public issue. It was being talked about a bit, but there was this sense that it was a bit inappropriate to make a centerpiece of a campaign, especially because Feinstein, had so often been reelected, was still popular in the state, all the other reasons that we talked about. I think it was Jane Meyer at The New Yorker who broke this taboo. I think there was an article, it was titled something, "We Need to Talk About Senator Feinstein." And it wasn't just speculation and rumor mongering. It was based on reporting. She had documented incidents involving Senator Feinstein and people who had, given her information, I think generally anonymously, but staffers who had interacted with her and her staff who felt as though they were really exposing the truth of the matter. And I think that was kind of a shattering of the glass moment when it became appropriate in the mainstream to start having this discussion about Senator Feinstein. And it's kind of the before and after of this discussion. Senator Feinstein is now 90 years old. And in a career that a person has, generally you would be expected to retire before you reach that age. I think that retirement benefits in the United States, they come in at age 65 now. So you're quite a bit on from that. And it would be, I think, refreshing if some leaders who are really at that stage of their life and career recognize that it's not undignified to retire in your 80s. Sometimes it's good to find the moment that your career can end with dignity and grace.
Calling something a taboo, calling efforts for transparency a taboo and breaking social norm is the way that, staffers try and shut people up, allies try and shut people up. Molly Jong-Fast, one of these big, powerful pundits in the Dianne Feinstein case, came out echoing what Jane Meyer had written in her piece. And she got attacked for being sexist from supporters of Dianne Feinstein, which is a ridiculous remark to make, especially considering it's Molly and her work and her views.
Justin, there was another reporter who pushed the limits of what was appropriate in this case, right? I think it's Ken Clipperstein of.
He went way over the limit.
So what he did was, once it became mainstream to start expressing outrage about Senator Feinstein's age and health, he started publishing on Twitter the names and contact information of some quite junior staffers in her office. And that was a new test of the limits of what's appropriate in this conversation. As we've been saying, there is a lot of responsibility on the staff in these situations. But is it appropriate to give out that contact information in that public setting, especially of very junior staffers? Justin, I'm sure you have a strong opinion about that.
Listen, I was a mid-level staffer. I would have been fine with the consequences of my actions being published, but they need to realize that the way that he was going about it, these mid-level staffers aren't the ones that are deciding whether or not she runs. If they resign, they can be easily replaced. Never mind, John, what you're saying. These were low-level staffers that he was shining a light on. And it was a form of coercion almost. It was a form of retribution maybe, because the progressives, the far, far left, I don't want to call him a progressive, but the far, far, far left of this country views Dianne Feinstein as a she-devil, right? She's a bogeyman. So no, I don't think that was appropriate. Sure, the chief of staff and people who could materially have an impact on whether or not she resigns, never mind the people that are actually running the day-to-day of the office with this woman who is clearly incapacitated. Go ahead. That's fair game. It's important information for the public. There's a transparency aspect there where we need to know more about these people, because if we know more about these people who are actually doing the job, then we can determine financial conflicts of interest. We can understand their background. They weren't elected, so they didn't go through a vetting process. But Ken took it way, way over the line. I think, though, we're largely focusing on older Democrats. We need to bring in Chuck Grassley, who there's been reports since at least 2016. I think he's also 88, 89, of him, a Republican, once venerated, once a great legislator in some aspects, specifically with regards to whistleblowers. He helped pass some of the strongest, most important whistleblower laws in the United States of America. He's clearly been on the decline now for some 6, 7, 8 years.
So Grassley is about to turn 90 years old, and he's been talking about running for re-election in the next election cycle. So
he's running. Too old. But again, it's not age. Age is not the problem. From my perspective, it's more being able to do your job. Mark Kirk was not that old. John Fetterman is not that old. I think we need to separate it, right? Senator Jim Inhofe was 88 when he retired. He was still quick as a whip. Former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, she's old. She's over 80. She's still clearly all there. She just ran the most, many would argue, the most effective speakership in certainly modern history, because she kept together a razor-thin margin where you had centrists like Connor Lamb working with far, far progressives like AOC and Rep. Omar, and they were able to pass some transformational legislation out of the House of Representatives and out of Congress. It simply wouldn't have gotten done without her. So I do think it's vitally important that we separate the two.
Yeah, age and health are separate matters with a heavy correlation, but they each matter on their own for different reasons. I just to give the audience a little bit of context, you mentioned Mark Kirk. We should just explain. Mark Kirk was a U.S. senator. I think he had a stroke, if that's correct. And he was not an elderly man. He was in his 50s or 60s, middle-aged, and he represented the state of Illinois. And he lost his seat in an election against Tammy Duckworth. And his health was an issue in that campaign, partly because of some strange, uncharacteristic comments that he was making that suggested that he was not in the same kind of mental state that he had been as the public had got to know him 6 years before when they elected him. But just like you said, there are people who are elderly who have demonstrated that they are at their full capacities or at least close to it. I mean, Tony Fauci comes to mind. At the time of the height of the pandemic, Tony Fauci could be in a meeting with Pelosi, McConnell, and Biden and been the oldest person in the room. He's actually older than all of them, but you wouldn't know it when you see him. He's still as sharp as ever, probably. Another example could be Morris Chang, who is the leader of maybe the most important company in the world, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, and he's been the focus of all kinds of intrigue in this new chip war between the U.S., China, and Taiwan. He's 92 years old, and he's still effectively at the helm of what's arguably the most critically important company anywhere in the world. So there's all sorts of people who have been quite old who have demonstrated that they still have these facilities. But what's interesting is we're talking about the ways, we're really emphasizing that health is this important factor. There's a whole nother conversation to be had about age as an independent factor and what happens even when healthy, you've got only one generation atop all the leadership positions in a country and the consequences that has on public policy and representation. I mean, even if all of your leaders are perfectly healthy, perfectly in control of their facilities, but they're all quite elderly, you are still missing something because you're missing the representation of a large part of the population. So even when healthy, age still matters. Age and health overlap, they correlate, but they matter each for different reasons.
Well, there were some rough currents for the Tea Party in Mississippi. Last night, Senator Thad Cochran fended off Chris McDaniel in a runoff to win the Republican nomination. Score one for the party establishment, still smarting from House Majority Leader Eric Cantor's primary loss.
Let's go back to 2014. This is the midterm, Obama's last midterm when he was in office. It's a race in Mississippi between Thad Cochran, who's the establishment Republican running in a primary against Chris McDaniel. And Chris McDaniel is a Tea Party challenger. We are talking about the worst of the worst type MAGA person before MAGA existed, right? The House Freedom Caucus on steroids. There was no real candidate that had name recognition, that was moderate, respected in the state, who could come in and realistically replace Thad Cochran on the ballot and beat this crazy guy back. So as a result, Thad Cochran ran for re-election with what many people would say is Alzheimer's. Allegedly, he had Alzheimer's. And I know this for a fact. He'd leave his office with his staff and he would not know how to get around the building. He would then also comment that he didn't know where he was, what he was doing. These are real things before the election. So he went through the primary election. In Mississippi, you need to get 50% of the vote to go on to the general election. Neither him nor his challenger got 50% of the vote. So what then happens is a runoff, and it's a pretty damn grueling runoff, and Thad Cochran had to win. So this all of a sudden, because of the time it fell on the calendar, became the most important election in Washington, D.C. Not only that, this guy is the former chairman of the Agriculture Committee. He's in a deep agriculture state, but also he's in line to be the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. This is all important. It'll become very clear soon why. Well, what does the Appropriations Committee do, John? They are the ones that control spending of the United States government, the budget. That with, Senate Majority Leader, when you're in the majority, is the most powerful job that you could have probably in U.S. Congress, arguably with the leader of the House of Propes and whoever the House Speaker is. So he's in line for this job that's going to control all this money. So what happens? In a very poor state where a dollar goes a long way, you have millions and tens of millions of dollars flooding Mississippi to ensure that this guy, who has been with large corporations his entire life, is not beaten by some upstart Tea Party Yahoo. This guy that these companies have relationships, decades-long relationships with, is able to win re-election. They had to wheel him around. The guy didn't even know where he was most of the time. He ran. I don't know how he did it with his mental capacity, but he was out there campaigning near 24/7, and the runoff came back 51-49. He ended up winning, and he became appropriations chair. So what does that mean? Okay, now you have one of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., so therefore one of the most powerful people in the world determining defense spending, all types of spending, who can't do the job. So what happens is that means the staff director, who I'm not going to name, ultimately is the person doing the job. So from my experience, I was working for the governor of Puerto Rico at the time. Hurricane Maria hits, and now we have a $90 billion appropriations request where we went through the House, Democrats and Republicans. We met with their staff directors, and we met with the Senate Democrat staff director. At the time, it was Senator Leahy's staff director. And these people all were negotiating finer points, but it was made very clear to us that the top line numbers needed to be decided by their bosses, right? We're asking for $90 billion. In this case, it was an appropriations bill before that, so we were asking for, I believe, $2.5 billion. Well, when it come to Thad Cochran, we were meeting with his staff director, and I turned to my former boss like, hey, George, this is really some big time shit we're about to do right now. We are going in and negotiating with the appropriator of the United States. The staff director who we were negotiating with, John, is not the appropriator. He is not elected. There is basically no transparency on that person. But we knew at the time Thad Cochran is in a wheelchair, not capable of handling himself, never mind determining the funding for Puerto Rico and rebuilding the island after the largest natural disaster in over 100 years in the United States. So we are all jazzed up. We're super pumped up. We go in there, we negotiate, and the guy gives us a sign off. He's like, no, this plan sounds good. It's fiscally responsible. We can have enough in the budget. We'll move ahead with this. And that was the first time we brought that plan to them. So he didn't ask for approval from his boss, who was elected by the voters. This guy basically made that decision and said, we need to go and speak with leadership. He didn't say we need to go speak with, our boss, Thad Cochran. Also, in all of these meetings with the House, Senate, with the House Republican and Democrat appropriators, with the Senator Leahy's staff, there were many, many staffers in that room. In this room, it was just the staff director, and he had one very junior staff taking notes. So at the end of the day, we got the request, and nothing was thought of it. We were like, oh, wow, we won this. But looking back on it, John, the American people were robbed because the guy making the decision here was unelected. There was no accountability. He did something that was akin to lying to the voters in Mississippi because they assumed that Thad Cochran would at least be making these absolutely major decisions. And that's why I think it's so important to realize, because this is undemocratic. It is against the spirit of our system, and it lends itself to so many different abuses. Guess what? That guy left Congress when Thad Cochran left Congress in 2018 and immediately became a lobbyist. So what was he doing? What was going on when he was literally running the appropriations process of the United States government? That is very concerning.
So, Justin, do you think that there's any responsibility on people who attended these meetings to shed that light on the problem, to go to reporters, to bring a bit of transparency to the issue. If people are going into these appropriations meetings like yourself and finding out about this situation and recognizing how concerning it is for all these reasons, we're talking about the problem of transparency and how investigative journalism has to play a role because there isn't transparency from the congressional position and the staff. Is there responsibility on people in a position like yours to expose the problem?
Well, I would say it depends, right? In this case, number one, everybody in Washington, D.C. knew. I'm not going to go on my whole spiel again, but the media was covering it up, which is distasteful. I saw one story in The Hill talk about Thad Cochran not knowing where he was going and getting lost in the Capitol, and that was a euphemism for his health issues. So what good would it do for an unnamed source to then come out to a member of the media? There were millions of Americans in Puerto Rico that needed the U.S. government to step up for financial aid so that they didn't starve to death, so that they got power back in a timely manner, so that trees were cleared from roads, so that people on dialysis who were in hospitals running on generators could get fuel or they could be transported from those hospitals. So in a moment like that, it was either say, I was an appointed official. I was not an unelected staff member like this joker that we were negotiating with. I had a responsibility first and foremost to the people in Puerto Rico that were suffering and quite frankly dying because not only of the hurricane, but the callous, half-hearted, just inadequate response from the Trump administration and FEMA. So if I had gone on the record, which could have, because we've established background quote wouldn't do anything because the media knew about this. If I had gone on the record, it then would have put the whole bill in jeopardy. And even after the bill had passed, we were still working on other appropriations. We were still working to lobby Trump to give us more support to save more lives. The focus would have been Justin Higgins, Puerto Rican staffer, is basically attacking Thad Cochran, and it would have jeopardized absolutely everything we were doing. And Trump, never mind at the time, other Republicans, but Trump specifically, was looking for any excuse to stop helping Puerto Rico. So to really answer your question, no, I had no responsibility in that instance. It was a decision between bad and worse. And I didn't want the death of Puerto Rican Americans to be on my hands because I tried to make a moral stand about a bigger ideological issue.
Well, I mean, there's the dynamic, right? I mean, this helps us understand exactly how this situation can happen, right? Because just like you said, there's too many things that are so important at stake. It's about prioritization. And if your responsibility is to try to advance this disaster aid, that's the most important thing for you to achieve. And the best way to successfully do that is working with this staff member to make it happen, right? And there are so many other issues that are before the Appropriations Committee that have a similar situation in front of them. And so it's easier for so many people to kind of work inside of the system as it's been constructed around these offices where the principal hasn't retired. And it's kind of a collective action problem, right? Because where is the responsibility? Everybody has a role to play and everybody's playing their own role in an appropriate way. We could even say the voters aren't showing responsibility. The voters aren't voting out people who are clearly not in a good health situation or should be at the graceful and dignified end of their career. That's what Kevin DeLeon was saying in California, right? And the voters decided not to. They decided to reelect Feinstein and reelect Grassley at age 91. Is the responsibility with them? Is the responsibility with the staff, who their job is to kind of keep the ship moving with limited disruption? Is the responsibility with the principal to know that it's time to retire, but they might not be in a mental state even to make that decision? So it's a challenging and difficult thing.
I don't think it is, though, because, take out a literal ongoing, unfolding natural disaster where people are being flown out of, where we were directing Blackhawks to go save newborn babies who were stuck in rural Puerto Rico, like literally days before we went into this meeting. Take that situation out of the context, because that is rare. And there were hundreds of other situations where this was not the case. I think largely speaking, with Thad Cochran, with John Fetterman, with Dianne Feinstein, there are two things. Specifically with Cochran, members were his staff and even members of his own party were going on background. So they were talking to media and they were telling them this is going on. But even without that, it is vitally clear to anybody covering Congress, because you have to cover appropriations, that he is not capable of doing his job. It's like when recently Senator Feinstein read a speech when she was just supposed to give a yay or nay vote. She was started to read a speech and her staff is like, no, you're not supposed to do that. And they had to shut her up because she doesn't know like where she is, what she's doing. You don't need people to go on the record to do that if you're in the media. You don't need people if you're a political pundit to go and say enough is enough. This is not all right. It should be abundantly clear, and there is a responsibility because it's these people's jobs to comment on what's happening politically, hopefully honestly, and it's the job of the media to report on it. And if you're not able to report that honestly, the voters, many of them see they're working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. They're not paying attention to this. They're going in, they're reading about the issues in a paper, checking the news, and going to vote. They're not going to all these stump speeches. Responsibility is not on them if the media is lying to them and all that they're doing is consuming the media to go make a vote. I think it's on the media largely.
Well, if the responsibility is with the media, then how come Senator Feinstein hasn't retired, right? Because like we said, Jane Meyer did her job as a member of the media, did the reporting, and published an article that made the situation quite clear, right? So if the media are doing their job, we still haven't had the result that we're seeking. We still haven't gotten a solution to the problem. So the responsibility is then somewhere else, isn't it?
Is it an overwhelming chorus from the media for Feinstein to resign?
Well, what would the breaking point be? I mean, how many stories do there need to be before she resigns, right? The responsibility then really is probably with the staff, isn't it? That's the way it seems. The chief of staff or maybe her family could engineer her retirement, but they're the ones who aren't doing so, right? I mean, the buck sort of stops with them, doesn't it?
Probably the family. Like, I don't know legally what the chief of staff could do. I think that in this case of Feinstein, Nancy Pelosi actually, I love her, and I think she's one of I love her accomplishments. Let me rephrase that. And I think she's one of the best speakers that I may ever see. But she's keeping this poor woman in her seat so that Newsom doesn't appoint somebody other than Adam Schiff. This is an electoral play by Speaker Pelosi.
Yeah, I mean, with the family, there's actually a case to be made here in the case of Feinstein in particular, because a story from Politico was just published very recently. It was actually today by Justin Gardner, who writes for the California Playbook at Politico. And he revealed that Senator Feinstein's daughter, Catherine Feinstein, has power of attorney over Senator Feinstein. Power of attorney, for anyone who doesn't know, is privileges that are usually granted when a person is incapacitated, that they need to bestow their decision-making powers on legal and financial matters to another person. So for power of attorney to be granted in the case of Dianne Feinstein to her daughter is a clear acknowledgement of awareness that Senator Feinstein is not in a position to make important decisions. It's a clear acknowledgement of that fact. So the fact that the daughter of Senator Feinstein has knowingly accepted power of attorney, perhaps even sought power of attorney in the situation, demonstrates that she's fully aware that Senator Feinstein should not be serving in the United States Senate, just by definition. If you're not in a position to make even decisions about your own finances, how could you be in a position to make decisions on behalf of 40 million people in the state of California? But back to this question of responsibility and where it lies, it's interesting that this was addressed in the case of the presidency by the 25th Amendment. And this is partly because of a situation kind of like the ones that we've been describing that happened with President Wilson. Woodrow Wilson suffered a stroke when he was president in the 1910s. And from that point forward, for the rest of his presidency, the decisions in the White House were actually being made by his wife, the First Lady, Edith Wilson. So Edith Wilson was convening cabinet meetings. She was making decisions on behalf of the executive. She was effectively the president of the United States in all but name. She was the de facto president of the United States. So for anyone who's not aware of this historical fact, you might know that the United States has indeed had a woman president. We've had a woman de facto president, which is an extraordinary achievement for equality. Not really, because Edith Wilson was never elected president. Her acting as president was quite illegitimate and quite concerning for the reasons that we've been describing. Someone who's not really been properly vetted by the public, who hasn't been bestowed with the public trust, who's not susceptible or liable to the same kind of important disclosures and so on, making decisions. It's very anti-democratic. And as a consequence of that situation, as well as the assassination of President Kennedy and all of the concern that that brought about the line of succession and what would happen if he had been shot but survived the attempt, situations that happened during Eisenhower's presidency when he had to periodically hand over the powers of the presidency to the vice president, Richard Nixon, because of heart attacks and other ailments. It did bring this question of what on earth do we do when the president is incapacitated and who's responsible for taking action? And what the U.S. Constitution has devised as a solution to this problem or as a way to address this problem is the 25th Amendment, which basically says that the cabinet are responsible, that the cabinet should convene and vote on whether they will remove the president from office if the president becomes incapacitated. And this should certainly have occurred in the case of President Wilson. There was a lot of question about whether it should have occurred after it had been enshrined in the Constitution when President Reagan was in office, and then when President Trump was in office, who did not always appear to be at their sharpest mental capacity. And it's part of our constitutional system. So in the case of the president, we've decided that the cabinet are responsible. If you carried that principle forward to congresspersons, you could say that it's really the staff that are responsible, and they're the ones who need to take action. They're sort of the equivalent of the cabinet as far as a member of Congress is concerned, right?
So I disagree. I think that I go back to the media, and that's because the people that have the power to actually remove them from office is their colleagues. So in this instance, if there was enough media pressure, it could make Senator Schumer's job easier to hold a vote to remove Feinstein. And you know, sure as shit, John, he'd get all the Republicans to vote with him. And he'd probably get a lot of Democratic allies because guess what? He's the Senate leader, majority leader, and he holds a lot of power. He basically determines in large part who sits on what committees and who gets to chair those committees. So in this instance, I actually think it is the other senators. It's the other senators for putting party first. The problem is it's basically asking these folks to be judge, jury, and executioner, right? They're supposed to determine and hold themselves accountable. So if it's like the owners in sports, unless something truly egregious happens, they're very unlikely to force another owner out of the league because they're very concerned that that in turn would then happen to themselves. So by resisting, heck, dude, Republican senators haven't really criticized Fetterman. They haven't really criticized Feinstein to my knowledge. They've held their powder dry because if you live in a glass house, you don't want to throw stones. So I would argue, because we know that a lot of these politicians don't always put the best interest of the country first, a lot of times, that it comes back to something needs to pressure them to step up to the plate and do it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in the way that you've described this dynamic where senators or members of Congress don't want to vote out their colleagues out of fear that it might happen to them. And it's similar to what we were talking about with the congressional physician. There are these institutional pressures to prevent action, and the institution does not want to take that kind of action. But relying on this vote for removal as a process to remedy this problem, that's a bit like relying on impeachment to remove a president. And I think that the logic of the 25th Amendment, even though it's not part of the legal system in the way that the body's vote for removal is, as you've astutely pointed out, if you carry that logic forward, you have another mechanism that's kind of supported by the logic of the Constitution to remove someone who's in a situation like this. But so there is also pressure on the staff not to take that action as well, because they'll be out of a job if they remove their boss, right?
Yeah, but I do think that there are some young staffers who got into this for the right reasons, and even older, jaded ones can be reminded of why they got into this line of work. And, sometimes they surprise you. Cassidy Hutchinson, for example, it's pretty clear that she probably burned down a lot of her career potential possibilities by going and testifying in front of the January 6th committee, but she put country first. I think that, when the lives of 3.5 million American citizens aren't weighing on your conscience because you need to negotiate with this staff director, and you're only thinking about your $40,000 a year Senate salary, it's easier in some regards to come forward. But I guess that leads us to the question, John. And you're right, I agree with you, if a vote for removal is just not going to happen, because let's go, it's going to be unrealistic. Does that lead us to, should we advocate for term limits? Should we advocate for some type of age limit? But how do we address this?
Well, again, we can look at the solution that amendments of the Constitution have devised for the case of the presidency and try extending that to Congress, right? And they have put in place term limits for the presidency. And they modeled the term limits of 2 terms basically based on the precedent set by George Washington, the first president. And only once was that tradition ever exceeded, when President Franklin Roosevelt was elected to 4 terms and served 3 and a bit of a term as president. So they introduced term limits for the presidency. And, we could try extending that the way that we've said we could extend the logic of the 25th Amendment. But I think that part of what's been missing from this conversation is the acknowledgement that the presidency is such a unique office and has these unique powers. And that's part of why it was important to amend the Constitution to address these risks. And we haven't felt the need, the urgency to address those risks in the case of members of Congress. But based on the anecdotes that we've been going through today, the leader of the Senate, now the minority leader, but until very recently, the majority leader in the Senate, someone who's clearly suffering from some kind of acute health risk, that is a very powerful and significant office. The appropriations chairman, Thad Cochran, in the story that you've told us, very important office, one of the most significant offices in all of U.S. government. Of course, the presidency has unique powers and responsibilities, a responsibility for national security to the extent that no member of Congress really does have. But are there any positions in Congress that are so important that you do need to start thinking about these things in similar terms? I think probably not, but the conversation is there.
I don't think there's a job in Congress that is as uniquely impactful as the president. I think that an age limit is beyond the pale. I also think term limits are rather silly. It takes time when you're a member of Congress to learn what the job is, to learn how to do it effectively, to move up the ranks once you do learn how to do it effectively, and go from backbencher to member of important committee to chairwoman of that important committee. That all takes time. I think that institutional knowledge is so vital for legislation.
So I haven't really made up my mind about this. I'm not exactly sure which way I fall down, but I do think that it's interesting that there's an age requirement to become a U.S. Senator. You have to be 30 years old to become a U.S. Senator. And there's no age limit. There's no age restriction on the upper side. There's an age restriction on the lower end, but not on the higher end. And that requirement of age 30, it seems a bit arbitrary, doesn't it? Because 18 is usually how we mark adulthood in the United States. Of course, you get the right to vote. You get the right to serve in the U.S. military, to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives at that point. Why is it 30 years old? You could imagine a world in which there was a similar cutoff date or age rather, on the upper end, that you have to be older than 30 and younger than 90 or younger than 85 years old. In regard to your points about term limits, I think that there has been some data that's demonstrated that senators or congressmen who have served a long period of time are more effective. And that's often been used as an argument against term limits, because as someone stays for a long time in their career, they gain that institutional knowledge and so on. They're able to be more effective in their jobs. But I think that could also be sort of a chicken and egg question, cause and effect question, because we do have a culture and a system that has valued seniority so much that we've given more responsibility and authority to people who have been around for such a long time, because we've decided that that's something that we value and care about. And so we've given more opportunities to members who are long tenured to get their names on bills and to take the leadership role in drafting and passing bills. And maybe we're actually locking out opportunities for younger and more junior members to play roles like that. I know that this has been an eternal source of frustration in the Democratic caucus, at least until very recently, when Pelosi formally handed off the reins to her chosen successor, Hakeem Jeffries. But for quite a long time, there was this frustration on the Democratic side that many of these younger and ambitious members of Congress were locked out of the leadership positions that they wanted to play. And these weren't particularly young people. They were much younger than Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and Jim Clyburn, the other leaders in the Democratic side. But they were not of an age where it would be unusual in an advanced democracy to see them playing a leadership role, people in their 40s and 50s. It is interesting that these key positions in U.S. government, the presidency and then the leadership of the House and Senate, has been sort of locked with leaders from a specific generation who have stayed for quite a long time. And it has taken away opportunities for younger people to play leading roles in our democracy.
So this is called the 118th Congress. It is the third oldest Congress since 1789. You mentioned that retirement age, where the government starts paying you out for being retired, is 65. The average age of the U.S. Senate is 63.9. So they are 1.1 years away from collecting their government-funded pension. The average age of the House, which you mentioned, is typically much younger than the Senate, is 57.5. Biden's 80. I don't know how old Trump is.
77.
But my question to you, John, would be, is this what it looks like in other countries? Is this normal?
Well, I think that it's comparable to some countries, but not others. And it's interesting the direction in which the U.S. is trending and which countries we've become similar to in the process, right? So right now, it's quite noticeable how young the leaders of many countries in Europe are. So Rishi Sunak, who is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the country that we're most often compared to, is only 43 years old. He's quite a bit younger than, for example, Barack Obama was when he became president. He was, I think, 47 or 48 when he became president. He was in his 50s for most of his presidency. He often seemed younger, but he was not remarkably young. Our youngest president ever, Theodore Roosevelt, I think, was about 41 years old, as was John F. Kennedy. He was of a similar age when he was elected. But Rishi Sunak is 43 years old. He's about the age that Pete Buttigieg is, and everyone describes Pete Buttigieg as this remarkably young wonderkind of a figure. He's 41, not much younger than Rishi Sunak. Emmanuel Macron, who is the leader of France, he is 45 years old, and he's been president since 2017. He became president when he was, 39 years old. Remarkably young, really not much older than we are right now. And another example I think one that's often given as an example of a young politician is the leader of Finland, who is now left office. But she's 37 years old now. She's a former prime minister at age 37. She became prime minister of Finland in 2019. So when she was 4 years younger than she is now, about 33 years old. She's already a former at age 37, at which point she would be, by quite a few years, the youngest president that had ever served in U.S. history. It is remarkable, and it's a big difference from what we're experiencing now.
President Zelensky is in his second term, and he's 45.
Yeah. So, and also Meloni, Giorgia Meloni of Italy, let's get her age, is a very young 46 years old. So we've got young leaders really across the continent right now in Europe. Instead, what the U.S. seems to be resembling more than Europe is probably Africa, where there's quite a few leaders who are quite old.
That's good. A paragon of democracy.
Well, I think that there's a very interesting conversation that can be had here for a number of reasons. But the example that comes to mind first is, of course, Paul Biya, the president of Cameroon, who is 90 years old, who is widely reported not to be living in Cameroon and not to have really visited the country in quite a few years, but is instead living in Europe.
So like former Senator Pat Roberts.
Yeah. I mean, did he spend...
He was found to be renting a place in Kansas, a basement in Kansas from his sister, but he, lived in D.C.
Well, he lived in D.C., so that makes him quite different from Paul Biya. Paul Biya is the president of Cameroon and is not spending time in that country. He's only the second president that Cameroon have ever had since their independence. And he has been in office now since 1982.
Oh, Jesus.
At age 90, he's still the official leader of that country. There was Robert Mugabe, the infamous Uncle Bob, president of Zimbabwe, who at age 94 and many decades in power finally inspired a coup d'etat, which the current leader of Zimbabwe, Emerson Mnangagwa, led. Really less out of concern over Uncle Bob's elderly and advanced age, but out of concern that Uncle Bob was planning to install his young wife as the next leader of the country. But what we're seeing right now in Africa, in a continent where the leaders really have become quite old in many cases, not just these very infamous ones, but even in other major countries where people aren't exactly setting records, but are generally old. I mean, for example, the new leader of Nigeria, Tinubu, he's 71 years old. Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa is now 70. The leader of Ethiopia is a bit younger, and that's sort of unusual on the continent. But in this continent where the leaders have become quite advanced in age and have tried to hold on to their positions for longer than is customary, we've seen a lot of outrage among the public and a lot of discontent, content, and a sense of illegitimacy of the political order. And this is one of the factors that has inspired this wave of coup d'etat across much of the continent, something that's been in the news quite a bit lately. In the last few years, we've seen, I think, 8 different countries in Africa have experienced these coup d'etat. And in some cases, it has been to remove leaders who are parts of family dynasties or have themselves personally held power for a long time. Just this week, most recently, I think it was yesterday when this hit the news, Gabon experienced a coup. And the leader of Gabon, Ali Bongo, is the son of the second president of Gabon, and he is himself the third president of Gabon. So we've got one family who have tried to hold on to their offices for much longer than you would like to see. And the discontent has finally resulted in the ouster of this family. And this is in a country that has, outside of its very small neighbor, Equatorial Guinea, the highest GDP per capita on the mainland of the continent. So a country that you would not necessarily think would have this level of discontent comparatively, but where there is so much unhappiness at the Bongo family's commitment to holding on to their offices for such a long period of time. And in the United States, we're talking about Senator McConnell, who has held on to his position for quite a long time. We were talking about Speaker Pelosi, who was held on to her position for quite a long time. President Biden looms over this conversation, someone who will be subject to term limits, but who has been part of American life in senior positions as a U.S. Senator starting in his 20s, since before the Watergate scandal. So we've got major figures who are holding onto their positions that are, in effect, blocking younger people from getting a chance to lead the country. And we are seeing not, of course, discontent at the same level as we're seeing in these other examples, but we are seeing a lot of unhappiness with that situation. There was a recent poll that showed that 69% of Democrats think that President Biden is too old to run for re-election.
Well, I think he's too old to run for re-election, but I want him to, and I'm going to vote for him. I mean, it's like you're between a rock and a hard place. Do we elect a potential Trump, which everybody knows our feelings on him? Or do we go with a guy who's too old and, clearly lost a step, doesn't have the same zip on his fastball, so to speak, or bite on his curveball? I think that's pretty clear. I did want to note that as you were running off these lists and mentioning coups and, I took it you were implying like sometimes U.S. leaders stay on to power and hold on too long, that there have been dignified examples. I think Speaker Pelosi is one, where she not only resigned, but she stayed in Congress along with Steny Hoyer and Whip Clyburn to be the backbone, to be the support system for that next generation of leaders of the House. That comes to mind. Honestly, John, the last time that I can think of an active leader of Congress or, the White House, for example, resigning, it's not because of age. I mean, this guy was no spring chicken, but resigning in a dignified way was John Boehner. He put the country first. He told the Tea Party to go shove it. He prevented a debt default. He passed the bill, and he knew it was going to cost him his speakership. So he did what was right for the country, and he resigned. And maybe LBJ, I just don't know enough about his presidency, but we just don't have enough, quite frankly, leaders that are willing to actually put their oath of office first. And we sure as heck don't have enough members of the media willing to hold their feet to the fire to ensure that they do.
Well, it would not be Politics Plus Media 101 if we did not have a mention of John Boehner at some point in the discussion. So perhaps once we've reached that level of the conversation, we've officially run out of things to talk about. So I think this has been a really interesting discussion about an important problem, a problem that's very sensitive and it can be difficult to talk about, but something that the country needs to talk about and has become, I think, increasingly part of our political dialogue.
John Boehner, I disagree with him a lot, but he was a great American. So let's not undermine Mr. Boehner.
We are in no way attempting to undermine Mr. Boehner and his incredible legacy.
A pox on your house, sir.
I think that in the future, they will add his face to Mount Rushmore. It's really only a matter of time. And the Washington Monument in the middle of the National Mall will be dwarfed by the even taller obelisk to John Boehner that will be built alongside it. Truly one of the foundational and significant figures in recent American history, without question.
And it's going to be it's going to be the size of a large wine bottle. So the extra large wine bottle with a menthol just sitting on top. And that's going to be the Boehner Monument.
I mean, you go up to any person on the street in the United States and you say, name a Speaker of the House, and it's Boehner, 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 Boehner. I mean, he's someone whose legacy it towers over the rest of us.
Remind me the next time that it is germane to tell you and the listeners a story of Senator John Barrasso, who may be the next Republican Senate leader. We'll leave on that cliff now.
Well, yeah, I mean, if McConnell retires, then we'll have an opportunity to talk about Senate leadership.